On Christmas Eve, he kicked her out with a small suitcase and a heart full of grievances. Alone and lost, an SUV stopped beside her. It was at this moment that the situation became even more intense. Caitlin stood on the sidewalk of a rich neighborhood, clutching a small suitcase. The thin coat she wore did little to protect her from the cold. Christmas lights glowed all around her, bright and festive, a sharp contrast to her dark, hopeless expression. She took a deep breath, her breath visible in the icy air. She felt numb. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to go. She could still hear Arthur's voice, sharp and angry. "Get out, Caitlin!" He had thrown her suitcase at her feet, the door slamming shut behind her. Caitlin didn't fight back. She had learned long ago that arguing with Arthur only made things worse. Now, standing alone, she looked around. The street was empty, houses decorated with lights, warmth inside. But there was no warmth for her. Not here. She started to walk, not knowing where she was headed. She felt disoriented, every step heavy, each one taking her further from what had been her home. Her hands trembled, partly from the cold, partly from the fear creeping into her chest. What was she supposed to do now? Her first thought was to call a friend. Caitlin took out her phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. No answer. She tried another, and another. Some went to voicemail. A few picked up. But once they heard what had happened, they hesitated. Arthur's influence was too strong. Nobody wanted to get involved, and Caitlin was left staring at her phone screen, tears stinging her eyes. No one would help her. She paused, sitting down on a bench in a small square, the cold biting through her thin clothing. Caitlin leaned forward, resting her face in her hands. She was alone again. It wasn't new. It reminded her of when her mother had left, years ago. She had been a teenager, lost and scared. Caitlin had promised herself she would never feel that kind of abandonment again. But here she was, on her own, and terrified. The wind cut through her, and she shivered. She had nowhere to go. No one was answering. The idea of going back to Arthur crossed her mind, no matter how much it hurt her pride. It would be warm there, safe, at least physically. She swallowed, wondering if she could survive on her own. Was she even strong enough for that? Just as Caitlin was about to give in to the hopelessness, she heard the hum of an engine. A black SUV slowed down as it approached her. The window rolled down, and she saw a man looking at her. He looked serious, but not unfriendly. "Hey," he said, his voice calm. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Caitlin looked up, her instincts screaming at her to be careful. But what choice did she have? She was out of options, and the cold was becoming unbearable. She nodded, unsure if she was making the right decision, but she knew she needed to do something. The man nodded back, reaching over to open the passenger door. "Come on in," he said. She hesitated for just a moment, then stood, taking one last look at the empty street before stepping into the SUV. Jason leaned slightly out of the driver's side window, the wind rustling his coat collar as he looked at Caitlin. "Are you okay? Need a ride?" His voice was steady, not pushy. Caitlin stared at him, unsure. Accepting a ride from a stranger went against every piece of advice she'd ever heard. But it was freezing, and she had nowhere to go. She took a second, looked down the dark street, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I need help," she said quietly. Jason nodded and unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in. She opened the door and slid into the seat, instantly feeling the warmth from the car's heater. Her body relaxed a little as the door closed beside her, shutting out the cold night. She glanced over at Jason, his eyes on the road, his hands relaxed on the wheel. He looked over, giving her a half-smile. "I'm Jason, by the way," he said. "Where do you need to go?" Caitlin swallowed, looking down at her hands. I don't really have anywhere," she admitted. Her voice was barely a whisper. Jason frowned slightly, but didn't push her. "Okay. Well, I can take you to a hotel, somewhere you can stay for the night?" She nodded, feeling both grateful and uncomfortable. She hadn't expected kindness, and she didn't quite know what to do with it. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city lights flickering by outside. Caitlin shifted in her seat, unsure if she should say something. Jason broke the silence first. "Look, I don't want to pry, but do you have anyone you can call? Family? Friends?" She shook her head, her eyes fixed on her lap. "No." "No one," she said, her voice cracking slightly. He nodded, seeming to understand. He didn't ask more, and Caitlin was thankful for that. Instead, he focused on the road, the hum of the engine filling the quiet space between them. After a while, he spoke again. "Listen, I'm a lawyer. I actually know Arthur. Not well, but enough to know the kind of person he is," Jason said, glancing over at her. Caitlin's heart sank. "You know him?" she asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if that made her feel safer or more in danger. "Yeah, professionally. I'm not on his side, if that's what you're wondering," Jason said, his tone gentle. "I know he can be difficult." Caitlin let out a bitter laugh. "Difficult is putting it lightly," she muttered. Jason nodded. "I figured, look, I don't mean to get involved if you don't want me to. But I know a good place where you can stay tonight, and I'll cover it. You don't need to worry about the cost." Caitlin looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Her voice was more defensive than she intended, but she couldn't help it. After everything with Arthur, trust didn't come easily. Jason shrugged, his eyes still on the road. "Honestly, you looked like you needed help. I've been there, needing someone, and finding no one around. I don't want to leave someone in that position if I can do something about it." She was silent for a moment, processing his words. Maybe he was sincere, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being vulnerable. Still, right now, she had no other choice. They arrived at a small hotel on a quieter street, away from the bright lights and bustle. Jason parked and got out, opening her door. Caitlin stepped out, her legs shaky, more from exhaustion than the cold. She followed Jason into the lobby, the warmth inside wrapping around her like a blanket. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. Jason spoke first. "A room for the night, please," he said, pulling out his wallet. Caitlin, feeling the weight of the situation, reached into her bag, taking out her credit card. She didn't want to owe him, but when she handed it over, the receptionist swiped it and frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it seems your card has been declined," the receptionist said, handing it back to her. Caitlin's stomach dropped. She stared at the card, her fingers tightening around it. Of course, Arthur would block her access to money. He always had to be in control. She felt her face flush, with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Jason gave her a sympathetic look, then handed his own card to the receptionist. "I've got it," he said simply. Caitlin wanted to argue, to push back, but she didn't have the energy. She nodded, accepting his help. though it made her feel small. Once the room was paid for, Jason turned to her. "Room 204. It's yours for the night," he said. "I'll be around if you need anything. I'm staying nearby." She nodded again, her voice barely audible. "Thank you," she said, turning towards the elevator. Jason watched as she disappeared behind the elevator doors, a thoughtful expression on his face. Caitlin, alone in the elevator, leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt humiliated, powerless, but at least she wasn't on the street. When she got to the room, she opened the door and stepped inside. It was small, but clean and warm. Caitlin dropped her suitcase beside the bed and sat down, her body feeling heavy. She looked around, her eyes landing on the phone on the nightstand. For a second, she considered calling Arthur, apologizing, begging to come back. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. She couldn't go back. Not after everything. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, she was safe. And for now, that had to be enough. Caitlin woke up to the sound of someone knocking on the door. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The hotel room. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. The knocking continued, and she got up, crossing the small room to the door. She opened it a crack and saw Jason standing there, holding a cup of coffee in each hand. "Hey," he said, giving her a small smile. "I thought you could use some coffee." Caitlin hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider, letting him in. He handed her one of the cups, and she took it, the warmth comforting against her cold hands. "Thanks," she said, her voice still groggy from sleep. Jason nodded, taking a seat in the small chair by the window. Caitlin sat on the edge of the bed, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong, and she appreciated it. "Did you sleep okay?" Jason asked, his tone casual. Caitlin shrugged. "As well as I could, I guess," she said. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you still here? You could have just left after last night." Jason met her gaze, his expression serious. "I told you, I want to help," he said. "Look, I know it's hard to trust anyone right now, especially someone you just met, but I mean it. I'm not here to make things worse for you." Caitlin was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You said you know Arthur," she said. "How?" Jason leaned back in the chair, his eyes on her. "I'm a lawyer. I've worked on a few cases that involved him. Nothing personal, but enough to know the kind of person he is," he said. Caitlin frowned. "What kind of person is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason hesitated, then spoke. "I've heard rumors about him, about his business dealings. Some of them aren't exactly legal," he said. "I think there's more going on than what you know, and I think that's why he wants you out of the picture." Caitlin's stomach twisted. She had always known Arthur wasn't the most honest person, but she hadn't realized it could be this serious. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jason looked at her, his expression sympathetic. "I don't know all the details, but I think he's trying to keep you away from something. Something that could get messy," he said. "I don't want to scare you, but I think you need to be careful." Caitlin felt a wave of fear wash over her. She had thought being kicked out was the worst of it, but now it seemed like there was even more at stake. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason set his coffee down on the table beside him. "For now, just stay here. I'll help you figure things out," he said. You don't have to face this alone." Caitlin looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, but after everything with Arthur, trusting anyone felt impossible. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jason met her gaze, his eyes sincere. "Because no one should have to go through this alone," he said. Caitlin looked away, her eyes stinging with tears. She hated how vulnerable she felt, how helpless. But at the same time, there was something about Jason that made her want to believe him. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, without judgment, without pity, just understanding. She wiped her eyes quickly and took another sip of her coffee. "So what now?" she asked, her voice steadier. Jason smiled slightly. "First, you need to eat. There's a diner down the street. We can get breakfast, and then we'll figure out our next steps," he said. Caitlin nodded, her stomach growling at the mention of food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Okay," she said, standing up. She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair and put it on. Jason stood as well, and they left the room, Caitlin locking the door behind her. They walked down the street in silence, the cold morning air biting at Caitlin's cheeks. She kept her hands stuffed in her pockets, her eyes on the ground. Jason walked beside her, his hands in his coat pockets as well. He didn't say anything, and Caitlin was grateful for the quiet. The diner was small and mostly empty. They took a seat in a booth near the window, and a waitress came over, handing them menus. Caitlin glanced at hers, but she wasn't really paying attention to the words. Her mind was still spinning from everything Jason had told her. Jason ordered for both of them, and the waitress left. Caitlin looked out the window, watching the cars pass by. "You really think Arthur's trying to keep me away from something illegal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded. "I do," he said. "And I think it's important that you stay away from him for now. At least until we know more." Caitlin swallowed, her throat feeling tight. She didn't know what to do. She had no money, no place to go. And now it seemed like she was in even more danger than she had realized. The food arrived, and Caitlin forced herself to eat, though she barely tasted it. Jason watched her, his expression concerned. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice soft. "You're not alone in this, Caitlin." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. She wanted to believe him, but it was hard. Trusting someone meant risking getting hurt again. But what choice did she have? She had nowhere else to turn. After they finished eating, they walked back to the hotel. Caitlin felt a heaviness settle in her chest as they approached the building. She didn't want to go back to that room, didn't want to be alone again. But she didn't know what else to do. Jason stopped at the entrance, turning to her. "I need to make some calls. See if I can find out more about what Arthur's up to," he said. "You should stay here. Rest." "I'll come back later." Caitlin nodded, though the thought of being alone made her stomach turn. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. Jason gave her a small smile. "It's going to be okay, Caitlin, I promise," he said. She watched as he walked away, disappearing down the street. Caitlin turned and went back inside, her heart heavy. She took the elevator up to her room and sat down on the bed, her mind racing. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to Arthur. Not now, not ever. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know if she could trust Jason, but for now, he was all she had, and that had to be enough. Caitlin stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, her eyes tired. She tried to brush her hair, but her hands were shaky. She had spent the entire morning waiting, unsure what Jason would come back with. Her phone was still useless, her credit cards blocked. It was like Arthur had erased her life in a matter of hours. She felt like a ghost, disconnected from everything she once knew. A knock on the door made her jump. She quickly set the brush down and opened the door a crack. Jason stood there, his face serious. He nodded at her. "Can I come in?" Caitlin opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. Jason walked into the room, his coat still on. He looked at her, his expression softening a little. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Caitlin shrugged, not knowing how to answer that. "I'm here," she said, her voice flat. Jason nodded, understanding. He took a deep breath. "I made some calls." "I found out a little more," he said, sitting down in the chair by the window. "Arthur's definitely involved in something shady. I don't know all the details yet, but it's bad enough that he's trying to keep you away from it. I think he's afraid you might become a liability." Caitlin swallowed, her stomach churning. "What kind of liability?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jason hesitated. "It's possible he thinks you know something, or that you might talk to the wrong people. He's trying to protect himself, Caitlin, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to make sure you stay out of the way." Caitlin sat down on the bed, her legs feeling weak. She didn't know what to do. She had never imagined Arthur would go this far. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with sympathy. "You need to protect yourself," he said. "I talked to a colleague, a family lawyer. She can help you start the process of filing for divorce. We need to get you out of his control, legally and financially." Caitlin's heart pounded at the word divorce. She had thought about it before, but she had never had the courage to go through with it. Arthur had always made her feel like she couldn't survive without him. But now, sitting here, she realized she didn't have a choice. She couldn't go back to him. Not after everything. She nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason gave her a reassuring smile. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "It's not going to be easy, but you're not alone in this." Caitlin looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if he fights back? What if he makes my life even worse?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason leaned forward, his expression serious. "He's going to fight back. He's not going to make this easy for you. But we're going to be ready. You're stronger than you think, Caitlin. And you've got people on your side now." She wanted to believe him, but fear was still gnawing at her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Okay, what's the next step?" she asked. Jason pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "I'm going to set up a meeting with my colleague, Sarah. She's experienced in cases like this, and she'll know exactly what to do. We can meet her today if you're ready." Caitlin hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, let's do it." Jason made the call, and a few minutes later, they were on their way to meet Sarah. Caitlin sat in the passenger seat of the SUV, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She knew this was the only way to take back control of her life. But the thought of facing Arthur terrified her. They arrived at a small law office on the other side of town. Jason led her inside, and they were greeted by a woman in her 40s, with short dark hair and a warm smile. "Hi, Caitlin. I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. Caitlin shook it, her hand trembling slightly. Sarah led them into her office and gestured for them to sit. She took a seat behind her desk, her expression kind but professional. "Jason told me a bit about your situation," she said. "I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to protect you. You're not alone in this." Caitlin nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't want to be scared anymore," she said, her voice cracking. Sarah nodded. "I understand. And that's why we're here. The first step is to file for divorce and request a restraining order. We need to make sure Arthur can't come near you or control your finances." Caitlin's heart pounded at the thought of taking such a big step, but she knew it was the only way. She nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Sarah smiled. "Good. We'll start with some paperwork today. It's going to be a process, but I'll be with you every step of the way." They spent the next hour going over forms and documents. Caitlin felt overwhelmed, but Sarah was patient, explaining everything in simple terms. Jason sat beside her, offering quiet support. By the time they were done, Caitlin felt drained, but there was a small sense of hope starting to grow inside her. As they left the office, Jason turned to her. "You did great today," he said. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing." Caitlin gave him a small smile. "Thanks," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jason shrugged. "You're stronger than you think, Caitlin. You just needed a little help to see it." They got back in the car, and Jason drove her back to the hotel. As they pulled up in front of the building, Caitlin looked over at him. "Do you think it's really going to be okay?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. Jason met her eyes, his expression sincere. "I do," he said. "It's not going to be easy, and there are going to be tough days, but you're not alone anymore. We'll get through this." Caitlin nodded, feeling a mix of fear and hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she had a chance. She got out of the car, giving Jason a small wave before heading inside. Back in her room, Caitlin sat down on the bed, looking at the stack of paperwork Sarah had given her. It was overwhelming, but it was also a step towards freedom. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she couldn't go back. She had to keep moving forward, no matter how scared she was. And for now, that had to be enough. Caitlin woke up early, her stomach in knots. Today was the hearing, the first real step in her fight against Arthur. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her as she got dressed. Her hands were shaking, and she struggled to button her blouse. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. A knock on the door startled her, and she quickly crossed the room to open it. Jason stood there, dressed in a suit, his face serious but calm. "Morning," he said. "You ready?" Caitlin nodded, though she didn't feel ready at all. She grabbed her coat and followed him out of the hotel room. They walked down the hallway in silence, Caitlin's heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she was walking towards her execution. The elevator ride down seemed to take forever, and by the time they reached the lobby, she felt like she could barely breathe. Jason led her to his SUV, and they drove to the courthouse. The streets were busy, people going about their lives, oblivious to what was happening in hers. Caitlin stared out the window, trying to keep herself together. She felt Jason's eyes on her every now and then, but he didn't say anything, and she was grateful for the silence. When they arrived at the courthouse, Caitlin's stomach twisted even tighter. She took a deep breath as they walked up the steps, trying to steady herself. Jason placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this," he said quietly. Caitlin nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. They entered the building, and Jason led her to a waiting area outside the courtroom. Sarah was already there, standing with a stack of papers in her hands. She gave Caitlin a warm smile as they approached. "Hey, Caitlin," she said. "How are you feeling?" Caitlin shrugged, not trusting her voice. Sarah nodded, understanding. "It's okay to be nervous. This is a big step, but you're doing the right thing." Caitlin took a shaky breath. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to go in there, and we're going to tell the judge everything. You're not alone, okay?" Caitlin nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to show weakness. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors opened, and a bailiff called their case. Caitlin's heart pounded as they walked inside. The room was small, the walls bare. The judge sat at the front, his expression neutral as he watched them enter. Caitlin saw Arthur sitting at the other table, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. Her stomach turned, and she had to force herself to keep walking. Sarah led her to their table, and they sat down. Jason sat behind her, his presence a small comfort in the intimidating room. Caitlin took another deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The judge called the case to order, and Sarah stood, addressing the court. She spoke confidently, explaining Caitlin's situation, the abuse, the control Arthur had over her life. Caitlin listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as Sarah laid out everything she had been through. But she knew it was necessary. She had to face this if she wanted to be free. Arthur's lawyer stood next, his voice cold as he tried to paint Caitlin as unstable, irrational. He argued that she was exaggerating, that Arthur had only been trying to help her. Caitlin felt her anger rising, but she kept her eyes on the table, refusing to look at Arthur. When it was her turn to speak, Caitlin stood, her legs feeling weak. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting the judge's. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as she went on. She told him about the years of emotional abuse, the way Arthur had controlled every aspect of her life. She spoke about the night he had thrown her out, the fear she had felt standing alone in the cold. As she spoke, she could feel Arthur's eyes on her, but she didn't look at him. She focused on the judge, on the truth of her words. She needed him to understand, to see what Arthur had done to her. When she finished, she sat back down, her hands still trembling. She felt Jason's hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked over at him, and he gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with pride. The judge listened as both sides made their final arguments, then took a moment to consider. The room was silent, the tension thick. Caitlin's heart pounded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt like she couldn't breathe, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Finally, the judge spoke. He granted the temporary restraining order, giving Caitlin the protection she needed. He also ordered Arthur to give her access to her finances until the divorce could be finalized. Caitlin felt a wave of relief wash over her, her body sagging in her seat. Arthur's lawyer stood, his face tight with anger. He whispered something to Arthur, who glared at Caitlin, his eyes filled with fury. She met his gaze for a moment, then looked away. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not here. Not now. The judge adjourned the hearing, and Caitlin stood, her legs feeling shaky. Sarah turned to her, giving her a smile. "You did great, Caitlin," she said. "This is a big step forward." Caitlin nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy." Caitlin took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice trembling. "But at least it's a start." Sarah nodded. "One step at a time. We'll keep fighting, and we'll get you through this," she said. They left the courtroom, Caitlin's heart still pounding. She felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, exhaustion. But there was also a small sense of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could get through this. As they walked out of the courthouse, Caitlin looked over at Jason. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "for everything." Jason gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me, Caitlin. I'm just glad I could help." She nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Caitlin stood in the doorway of her new apartment, the key still in her hand. The place was small, just a single room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom. But it was hers. She took a deep breath, stepping inside. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed, but it was clean. She dropped her bag by the door and walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She turned back to the empty room, her eyes scanning the sparse space. She felt a mix of fear and determination. This was her chance to start over, but it also meant she was truly on her own. No Arthur to tell her what to do, but also no safety net if she fell. She had to make this work. A knock on the door made her jump, and she quickly crossed the room to open it. Jason stood there, holding a plastic bag. He gave her a small smile. "I brought some essentials," he said, handing her the bag. Caitlin took it, looking inside. There were a few groceries, basic things like bread, milk, and eggs, along with some cleaning supplies. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jason nodded, stepping inside. He looked around the small apartment, his expression thoughtful. "It's not much, but it's a start," he said. Caitlin nodded, setting the bag down on the counter. "Yeah, it's something," she said. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know where to start." Jason gave her a reassuring smile. "One step at a time," he said. "You're already doing it. You've got your own place. That's a big step." Caitlin nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to cry in front of him. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I need to find a job," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't keep relying on you." Jason nodded, understanding. "I get it. I actually made some calls, talked to a few people I know. There's a small office downtown that might be hiring. It's not much, just a receptionist position, but it's a start." Caitlin looked at him, her heart swelling with hope. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded. "Yeah, I can take you there tomorrow if you want. It's nothing fancy, but it's a good place to start." Caitlin took a deep breath, her eyes filling with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. Jason gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me, Caitlin. You're doing this on your own. I'm just here to help." She nodded, her eyes stinging with tears. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't know how to do this. I've always had Arthur, even if he was." Jason interrupted gently. "Controlling?" Caitlin nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. "Yeah, I just don't know if I can do it on my own." Jason looked at her, his expression soft. "You can, Caitlin? You're stronger than you think. You've already come this far." She nodded, though she still wasn't sure if she believed him. She took a deep breath, trying to push her fear aside. She had to do this. She had no choice. Jason stayed for a little while longer, helping her unpack the few things she had. He made sure she had everything she needed before he left, giving her a reassuring smile as he stood in the doorway. "If you need anything, just call me," he said. Caitlin nodded, giving him a small smile. "I will. Thanks, Jason." He nodded, then turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Caitlin stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. She felt a mix of fear and determination. She was really on her own now. She had to make this work. She spent the rest of the day unpacking her things, organizing the small apartment as best as she could. She cleaned, scrubbing the counters and wiping down the windows. She wanted to make the place feel like home, even if it was just temporary. By the time the sun began to set, Caitlin was exhausted. She sat down on the small couch, her eyes closing for a moment. She had done it. She had made it through the first day. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Jason picked her up, taking her to the office he had mentioned. It was a small place, just a few people working behind desks. The manager, a woman in her 50s with a kind face, interviewed her. It wasn't anything complicated: answering phones, scheduling appointments, keeping things organized. Caitlin was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke, but the manager seemed to like her. By the end of the interview, she had the job. It wasn't much, but it was a step towards independence. She started the following week. The work was simple, but it kept her busy, kept her mind off everything that had happened. The people there were kind, though Caitlin kept to herself for the most part. She wasn't ready to let anyone in. Not yet. After her first day, she came home to her small apartment, dropping her bag by the door. She felt exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. She had done it. She had made it through her first day of work. She was starting to build a new life, piece by piece. Jason called her that evening, asking how her day had gone. Caitlin smiled as she spoke to him, telling him about the office, the people she had met. He listened, his voice warm and encouraging. He made her feel like she could do this, like she could really start over. After they hung up, Caitlin sat down on the couch, looking around her small apartment. It still felt empty, but it was starting to feel like hers. She was doing it. She was making it on her own. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She still had a long way to go, but she was moving forward, and that was enough for now. Caitlin settled into her new routine, waking up early each morning, getting dressed, and heading to work. The job at the small office wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was earning her own way. She would take the bus downtown, always carrying her bag with her few essentials, her wallet, a notebook, and her phone. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The office was simple, just a small reception area, a few desks, and a tiny break room. Caitlin's duties mostly involved answering phones, organizing schedules, and filing paperwork. The manager, Sheila, was kind and patient, always taking time to explain things to Caitlin when she was unsure. The other employees were friendly enough, though Caitlin kept to herself, still wary of letting anyone get too close. Sheila often spoke to her in between calls, asking her how she was settling in. Caitlin appreciated it, though she often found herself giving short, guarded answers. Trust didn't come easily anymore. "Hey, Caitlin, you want to join us for lunch today?" One of the other receptionists, Beth, asked one afternoon as they were wrapping up the morning calls. Caitlin hesitated, her instinct telling her to decline, but Beth's smile was genuine, and Caitlin knew she had to start somewhere. Sure," she said, nodding. Beth smiled wider. "Great. We usually go to this little sandwich place down the street. It's nothing fancy, but the food's good." They walked to the small sandwich shop a few blocks away, and Caitlin found herself slowly relaxing as Beth and another coworker, Maria, chatted about their lives. They didn't pry into Caitlin's situation, and she was grateful for that. They spoke about their families, their weekend plans, the things they liked to do in their free time. It was simple, normal, and Caitlin realized how much she had missed just being part of a casual conversation. When she returned to her apartment that evening, Caitlin felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't anything grand, but it was a step towards feeling like herself again. She was starting to build a life that wasn't defined by Arthur, a life that belonged to her. Jason called that night, as he had most evenings since the hearing. Caitlin answered, her voice tired but light. "Hey, Jason." "Hey, Caitlin," he replied. "How was your day?" She smiled, sitting down on her small couch. "It was good. I actually had lunch with some of the girls from work today." Jason's voice brightened. "Really? That's great, Caitlin. I'm glad you're starting to feel comfortable there." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Yeah, it's still different, you know? But I think I'm getting used to it." Jason paused for a moment, then spoke, his tone careful. "I'm proud of you. I know this isn't easy, but you're doing it. One step at a time." Caitlin felt a warmth in her chest at his words. She still wasn't sure what to make of her relationship with Jason. He had been nothing but kind to her, supportive and patient, but the idea of letting herself depend on someone again scared her. She didn't want to fall into the same patterns she had with Arthur. She wanted to be able to stand on her own first. "Thanks, Jason," she said quietly. "I really appreciate everything you've done for me." "Anytime," he said. "And if you need anything, you know where to find me." After they hung up, Caitlin leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She liked talking to Jason. He made her feel safe, like she wasn't alone, but she was afraid of what that could mean. She had let herself trust Arthur once, and it had led her here, struggling to rebuild her life from the ground up. She wasn't ready to open herself up to that kind of risk again. Not yet. The next few weeks went by, each day blending into the next as Caitlin continued her routine. She worked, she came home, she called Jason. Slowly, she began to feel more comfortable in her new life. She began to take pride in her work, her confidence growing as she learned the ropes at the office. Sheila even complimented her one day, saying she was catching on quickly. "You're doing great, Caitlin," Sheila said, giving her a warm smile. "I'm really glad to have you here." Caitlin smiled back, her chest swelling with pride. It felt good to hear that, to feel like she was capable of something, like she was contributing. One Saturday afternoon, Caitlin found herself sitting on her couch, staring at her phone. Jason had texted her earlier, asking if she wanted to grab coffee. She had hesitated, unsure if she should say yes. Part of her wanted to see him, but another part of her was scared. Scared of what it might mean, of what he might expect. She took a deep breath, typing out a response before she could change her mind. "Sure. Where do you want to meet?" A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. "There's a nice little cafe a few blocks from your place. I'll send you the address." Caitlin got ready, her heart pounding as she put on her coat and grabbed her bag. She walked to the cafe, her hands clenched tightly in her pockets. She spotted Jason through the window, sitting at a table near the back, his face lighting up when he saw her. She walked over, giving him a small smile as she sat down. "Hey," she said. "Hey," Jason replied, his eyes warm. "Thanks for coming." They ordered coffee, and Caitlin found herself relaxing as they talked. Jason asked her about work, and she told him about the office, about Sheila and Beth and Maria. He listened, his eyes never leaving her face, his attention fully on her. He didn't push, didn't ask about Arthur or anything else she wasn't ready to talk about. He just listened. Caitlin found herself laughing at one of his stories, the sound surprising her. It had been so long since she had laughed like that, so long since she had felt anything close to happy. She looked at Jason, her eyes softening. Maybe she could let him in, just a little. As they finished their coffee, Jason looked at her, his expression serious. "I know you've been through a lot, Caitlin, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. But I want you to know that I care about you, and I'm here, whenever you're ready." Caitlin's heart pounded, her chest tightening. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She took a deep breath, then looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared, Jason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to depend on anyone again. I need to know I can do this on my own first." Jason nodded, his eyes soft. "I understand, and I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need." Caitlin felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears. She nodded, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Jason reached across the table, his hand resting on hers for a moment. "You're stronger than you think, Caitlin. And I'll be here whenever you need me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could let herself hope again. Caitlin stood in front of her closet, staring at her clothes. She was nervous, her hands feeling clammy. It was just a dinner, just a simple, casual dinner with Jason. But it felt like so much more. It felt like a step she wasn't sure she was ready to take. She had agreed to meet him for dinner at a small restaurant he had suggested, and now, standing in her small apartment, she felt her nerves creeping in. She finally settled on a simple sweater and jeans, something comfortable. She wasn't trying to impress him, she just wanted to be herself. She took a deep breath, grabbing her coat and her bag before heading out the door. The restaurant was a cozy little place, nothing too fancy, just warm lighting and a relaxed atmosphere. Caitlin arrived a few minutes early, and she saw Jason already sitting at a table near the window. He smiled when he saw her, standing up as she approached. "Hey," he said, his smile genuine. "Glad you made it." Caitlin returned the smile, feeling her nerves ease just a bit. "Hey," she replied, sitting down across from him. She took a deep breath, trying to relax. Jason had never given her a reason to feel anything but comfortable, and she knew she needed to trust that. They ordered their food, and as they waited, Jason started telling her about his day. He talked about his work, some of the cases he was dealing with. Caitlin listened, her eyes on him, and she found herself smiling at the way he spoke. He was passionate about his work, and she admired that. "How about you?" Jason asked, his eyes meeting hers. "How's everything going with you? Work still going well?" Caitlin nodded, taking a sip of her water. "Yeah, it's good. I'm starting to feel more comfortable there. The people are nice, and it's nice to have something to do, you know, something that's mine." Jason nodded, his expression soft. "I'm really glad to hear that, Caitlin. You deserve to have something that's yours." Caitlin looked down at her hands, feeling a warmth in her chest. She still struggled with believing she deserved anything good, but Jason's words made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. Their food arrived, and they ate, the conversation flowing easily between them. Jason made her laugh, and Caitlin felt herself relaxing more and more as the evening went on. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this, just sitting with someone, sharing a meal, feeling connected. She had been so isolated for so long, and now, sitting here with Jason, she felt a sense of normalcy that she hadn't felt in years. After they finished eating, they lingered at the table, neither of them in a rush to leave. Jason looked at her, his eyes serious. "Caitlin, I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want you to feel pressured, but I need you to know that I care about you. A lot." Caitlin's heart pounded, her eyes meeting his. She swallowed, her throat feeling tight. "Jason, I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't want to depend on anyone again." "I can't go through that again." Jason reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "I understand, and I'm not asking you to depend on me. I just want to be here for you, however you need me. No pressure, no expectations, just me." Caitlin looked at their hands, her eyes stinging with tears. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to trust you, Jason. I really do. But it's hard." Jason nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know, and I'm willing to wait, as long as it takes." Caitlin looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the patience. He wasn't Arthur. He wasn't trying to control her, to make her feel small. He just wanted to be there. And maybe that was enough. She nodded, her voice breaking. "Okay, I want to try." Jason smiled, his eyes softening. "That's all I need, Caitlin. Just you, trying. That's more than enough." They left the restaurant together, walking out into the cool night air. Jason offered her his arm, and Caitlin hesitated for a moment before taking it. It felt strange, but also comforting. She looked up at him, and he gave her a small smile. "Do you want me to walk you home?" he asked, his voice gentle. Caitlin nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." They walked in silence, the streets quiet around them. Caitlin felt a mix of emotions, fear, hope, uncertainty. But as they walked, she felt something else, too. She felt a sense of safety, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She looked at Jason, his face calm and steady, and she realized that maybe she could let herself trust him. just a little. When they reached her apartment building, they stopped at the entrance. Caitlin turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Thank you, Jason, for tonight, for everything." Jason smiled, his eyes warm. "Anytime, Caitlin, I mean it." She nodded, her heart pounding. She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. She pulled back, her face flushing. "Good night, Jason." Jason's eyes softened, a smile spreading across his face. "Good night, Caitlin." She watched as he walked away, disappearing down the street. Caitlin took a deep breath, turning and heading up the stairs to her apartment. She felt a mix of emotions, fear, hope, and something else. Something that felt a little like happiness. When she got inside, she closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. She had taken a step tonight, a step towards something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but she had done it. She had let herself be vulnerable, just a little, and maybe that was enough for now. She walked over to the window, looking out at the street below. She could still see Jason walking away, his figure growing smaller until he turned the corner and disappeared from view. Caitlin took a deep breath, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could let herself hope again. She turned away from the window, heading to her small bedroom. She changed into her pajamas, the events of the evening still running through her mind. She lay down on her bed, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. She was scared, yes, but she was also hopeful. And that was more than she had felt in a long time. Caitlin stood in the middle of the bustling Christmas market, her eyes scanning the brightly lit stalls. The air was cold, but she was wrapped in a thick coat, a colorful scarf around her neck. People moved around her, laughter and conversation blending with the holiday music playing in the background. She took a deep breath, her breath visible in the chilly air. It was Christmas Eve, exactly a year since everything had changed. She turned and spotted Jason a few feet away, examining a display of handmade ornaments. He looked up, catching her eye, and gave her a warm smile. Caitlin smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She still wasn't used to feeling this way, safe, content, but she was learning to accept it. Jason walked over to her, holding up a small ornament shaped like a heart. "What do you think?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. Caitlin looked at it, her smile widening. "It's cute," she said. "Are you planning on getting a Christmas tree this late?" Jason shrugged, a playful grin on his face. "Maybe. Or maybe I just thought it would look nice on your shelf." Caitlin's heart fluttered at his words. She took the ornament from him, turning it over in her hands. It was simple, just a small wooden heart painted red. But it felt like more. It felt like a symbol of everything she had gained over the past year. She looked up at Jason, her eyes softening. "I think I'll take it," she said, her voice quiet. Jason smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, but Caitlin stopped him, shaking her head. "I've got it," she said. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a proud smile spreading across his face. Caitlin paid for the ornament, tucking it carefully into her bag. She looked around the market, the lights twinkling, the air filled with the scent of pine and hot cocoa. It felt almost magical, like she was in a different world from the one she had known a year ago. Jason took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers, and they continued to walk through the market. Caitlin leaned into him slightly, feeling his warmth. She had spent so long being afraid of letting someone in, but with Jason, it felt right. It felt like something she could trust. They stopped at a small stall selling hot chocolate, and Jason ordered 2 cups. He handed one to Caitlin, and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup, taking a sip. The rich chocolate flavor filled her mouth, and she smiled, feeling a sense of comfort. "This is nice," she said, her voice soft. Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with affection. "Yeah, it is," he said. "I'm glad we're here together." Caitlin nodded, her eyes meeting his. She had spent so much time being afraid of the future, of what might happen if she let herself trust again. But standing here, with Jason by her side, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for, and she had people in her life who cared about her, who wanted to be there for her. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the small wrapped package she had brought with her. It wasn't much, just a simple gift, but it was something she had wanted to give Jason. She pulled it out, holding it out to him, her heart pounding. "I got you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jason looked at her, surprised. "You didn't have to do that, Caitlin," he said, his voice gentle. "I know," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But I wanted to." Jason took the package, his eyes softening. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing a small leather journal. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Caitlin, this is amazing," he said, his voice thick. Caitlin smiled, her eyes stinging with tears. "I know you like to write things down, your thoughts and all that. I thought maybe you could use it." Jason nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached out, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "This means a lot to me." Caitlin hugged him back, her eyes closing. She felt a sense of peace wash over her, a feeling that everything was going to be okay. She pulled back, looking up at him, her eyes filled with hope. "I don't know what the future holds, Jason," she said, her voice steady. "But I know I want you to be a part of it." Jason smiled, his eyes shining. "I want that too, Caitlin. More than anything." They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading away. Caitlin took a deep breath, feeling a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in a long time. She was no longer defined by her past, by the pain and fear that had once controlled her. She was free to create her own future, to build a life that was hers. They continued to walk through the market, the lights twinkling above them, the air filled with laughter and music. Caitlin felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. She looked over at Jason, his face lit up by the glow of the lights, and she knew that she had made the right choice. She had chosen to let herself be happy, to let herself trust again. As they reached the edge of the market, Caitlin stopped, looking up at Jason. "Do you want to come over for dinner?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jason looked at her, his eyes softening. "I'd love to," he said. Caitlin smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. They walked back to her apartment, their hands intertwined, the world around them filled with the magic of the season. It was a simple night, but it was perfect. It was everything Caitlin had ever wanted, a sense of peace, of belonging, of love. When they reached her apartment, Caitlin unlocked the door, holding it open for Jason. He stepped inside, looking around the small space. It was modest, but it was hers, and that made it special. Caitlin set her bag down, pulling out the small ornament she had bought earlier. "Where do you think we should put this?" she asked, holding it up. Jason smiled, looking around the room. "How about on the shelf by the window?" he suggested. Caitlin nodded, walking over to the shelf and placing the ornament on it. She stepped back, looking at it, and a smile spread across her face. It was just a small decoration, but it represented so much more. It represented hope, resilience, and the new life she was building for herself. Jason walked over to her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Caitlin leaned into him, her eyes closing for a moment. She felt safe, truly safe, for the first time in a long time. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she wasn't facing them alone. She had Jason, she had her job, and most importantly, she had herself. She looked up at Jason, her eyes filled with love. "Merry Christmas," she whispered. Jason smiled, his eyes soft. "Merry Christmas, Caitlin." They stood there, the warmth of the apartment wrapping around them, the world outside quiet and still. It was a different Christmas from the one she had experienced a year ago, a Christmas filled with hope, with love, and with the promise of a better future. And for Caitlin, that was more than enough.